The following is an excerpt from a discussion series with nondual teacher Rupert Spira and philosopher Bernardo Kastrup. We start with a 20-minute guided meditation from Rupert, followed by a discussion and Q&A. You can join future iterations and our mailing list at adventuresinawareness.com. Please make yourself comfortable to get the most out of the initial guided meditation, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
So just be aware of the full spectrum of your experience without trying to change or manipulate it in any way. And be sure to include the full range of your experience, both our so-called interior experience, thoughts, images, feelings or emotions, sensations of the body, and our so-called external experience, that is, our perception of the world. And by perception, I don't just mean our sight of the world, I mean sights, sounds, tastes, textures, and smells. So just be aware of the entire range of your experience. Now, notice that all thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions arise, exist briefly, and then disappear. So imagine that the current perception, the current sight of the world, if your eyes are open, although I would recommend, at least to begin with, that you keep your eyes closed. Imagine that the current perception or perceptions, the sight, sound, taste, texture, or smell of the world disappears but is not replaced by the next perception. In other words, your perceptions leave you but are not replaced by another perception. It's a little bit like falling asleep at night. When we fall asleep at night, our perceptions of the world naturally, effortlessly, spontaneously leave us. So it should be relatively easy for us to imagine our perceptions leaving us and not being replaced. And now imagine that your current experience of the body leaves you. With our eyes closed, our only experience of the body is the current sensation or flow of sensations. So the tingling of your face or hands or feet, or the experience of hunger or thirst, and so on. Just imagine that the current sensation leaves, disappears, and is not replaced by the next one. Again, this is what happens naturally, effortlessly, spontaneously when we fall asleep at night. So it should not be difficult to imagine this happening now. Our perceptions and our sensations have disappeared. All that remains all that we are aware of, our thoughts, images, feelings. It's a bit like falling asleep and no longer being in the waking state. We're now in the dream state, but we're wide awake. There are no sensations or perceptions to be aware of. We're just aware of thoughts, images, and feelings. We are, as it were, falling asleep whilst remaining awake. And now imagine that any feelings or emotions that may be present disappear and are not replaced by the next one. You're just aware of thoughts and images. Now the current thought comes to an end, but is not replaced by the next one. You're just aware of images. And now the current image disappears and is not replaced by the next one. Now ask yourself the question, when all the objects of my experience, the content of my experience has been removed, what remains? And don't work this out rationally. It is your actual experience. It is our experience that we are aware of, thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. And so we can refer to our actual experience of what remains when all of these are removed. We have, in effect, fallen deeply asleep whilst remaining awake. Previously, we were aware of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. Now, in the absence of all of these, we are simply aware. All that remains is the fact of being aware, or the awareness of being. Being aware, or the awareness of being, is not a new experience that has been generated by this contemplation. Being aware was always present in the midst of our experience. But it was obscured by our awareness of experience. In other words, the awareness of experience obscured the awareness of being. Now, in the absence of experience, the awareness of being, or being aware, simply shines by itself, as it always is. Now ask yourself the question, again, referring only to your experience, that is the awareness of being or being aware. Ask yourself, what is the nature of being aware or awareness itself? The awareness that I essentially am. What is its nature? You are having the experience of being aware, or you are aware of being. So it's not necessary to think about this or work it out. We can actually refer to our direct, intimate, innermost experience, the simple fact of being or being aware. What is its nature? What are its qualities, if we can legitimately refer to its qualities? It's like asking, what are the qualities of the screen after the movie has faded from it? What are the qualities of being aware or awareness itself after it has been divested of all the qualities that it temporarily borrows from the content of experience? It is, as it were, colorless, empty, at least empty with reference to objects, silent, still. Having been divested of the agitation that characterizes our thoughts, it is at peace. Having been divested of the sorrow that characterizes our emotions, it is without any sense of lack or incompleteness. And this absence of lack or incompleteness, which is the essential nature of each of ourselves, is the experience that we will later refer to as happiness. This peace that is the underlying nature, our essential underlying nature, the peace that is the nature of being aware or awareness itself, is not a manufactured peace that can be brought about by controlling or stilling the mind. It is a peace that is inherent in our essential self or being and has nothing to do with what is or is not taking place in our experience. It cannot be brought about or manufactured, nor need it be, for it is already present, lying, as it were, unnoticed behind the content of experience, and as such, need only be recognized. So I don't want to take time away from our conversation, so I'm not going to say much more, but I'm just going to hint at two other qualities, if we can call them qualities, of our essential nature of simply being or being aware. First, that divested of all the qualities that it derives from the content of experience, being aware or awareness itself is without any objective qualities and is as such unlimited, because there is nothing within itself with which it could be limited. Consider the possibility then that the awareness that is the essential nature of each of our minds pervades each of our minds intimately, but is not limited to the mind, and is as such shared. In other words, although our thoughts, feelings, sensations, and so on are individual and unique, the field of awareness with which they are known and in which they appear extends way beyond the limitations of our personal minds and is shared across all minds. And I would suggest that this recognition that at the deepest level we share our being or we share our nature is the experience that we will later refer to as love. one last suggestion, that the awareness that is the essential nature of each of us is not only shared between all people and, by extension, all animals, but is also shared by all things. In other words, at the deepest level, the awareness that we essentially are is the single, infinite, and indivisible reality from which all people, all animals, and all things derive their apparently independent existence. Okay, let's leave it there, and we can begin our conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So as a little overview for the group, there's some planned questions that were submitted in Nalt, and I'll invite you to read your own question when they come up. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat. Generally, it tends to be too busy for me to read everything. So if you have a burning question, don't feel shy to just repeat the question in the chat. And at any point, Bernardo and Rupert may engage in dialogue as well. But I will just see if there's any questions just about the contemplation that was just guided before I go to the not questions. And indeed, Bernardo, if there's anything you want to comment on that in terms of how you feel those direct experiential contemplations inform or don't inform your work, if it's kind of parallel and like a happy coincidence, or at some level, as you engage with them, or indeed other Western philosophers, because I understand you've been more involved in the Western kind of lineage of idealism. If you see these kind of contemplations come up, other than just the famous "I think, therefore I am" kind of thing that everyone knows.
Should I answer now?
Yeah, if you have something to say on that topic, yes. Yeah.
I don't think it's a happy coincidence. I don't think it's a by chance accidental thing. I think it's structural. I think we have at least 3 avenues towards knowledge, towards learning something about nature and ourselves. One is reasoning, another is objective empirical evidence, and the royal of the 3, the royal one, the royal path is introspection. And I don't think it is merely accidental that all 3 ultimately leads to the same conclusions, since each one of them just looks at a different facet of the same underlying reality that is at the foundation of our own being and the rest of nature. The Western tradition has begun as a contemplatory tradition as well. The founders of the Western tradition are Parmenides and Empedocles, and they were contemplatives, and they wrote in the form of poems. Parmenides talked about the one, which he described metaphorically as a sphere. Empedocles talked about the divine nature of all beings. And what got to us today in popular culture is a caricatural version of that. What we learn about Empedocles is that he thought he was God, so he jumped inside Mount Etna to prove that he was an immortal, and all we have left is one of his sandals. that's a caricatural misportrayal of somebody that through introspective contemplation has understood that in Rupert's language, the awareness of being is the foundation of all being. And therefore, there is a sense, a very strong sense, perhaps the only important sense, in which we are divine in that sense, in the sense that we are made of the very stuff that underlies all creation. And that our deepest sense of self, which is not the egoic sense of self, has no boundaries, spans across all nature. So I don't think it's accidental. I think over time, already one generation after Parmenides and Empedocles, starting with Plato and then with Plato's pupil, Aristotle, we, in the West, we started replacing pure contemplation, introspective insight, with thought experiments, which have eventually come to play a similar role in the Western tradition. Thought experiments have underpinned even Einstein's rationale for the special and the general theory of relativity. But if you think about what a thought experiment is, it is a form of introspection that borrows the form of empirical experimentation. It borrows that form, but its essence is introspective. It is a thought experiment. The experiment happens inside yourself. It happens in your mind. And thought experiments, I think, I don't think they are the royal avenue to knowledge, but I believe often they can bring us to very similar mental spaces or very similar felt conclusions, so to say, that are more than just conceptual conclusions when they are applied correctly. And there are thought experiments that can bring you to a very similar place in the mind as the place Rupert has just taken us all to.
Okay. Hello, Rupert and Bernardo and everyone. I just wanted to quickly ask, because some people, including myself, are struggling between meta-consciousness and consciousness, which you guys talk about. Was the state that we were just in during your meditation what is considered just consciousness, the drone in Hinduism? Is that what you guys mean, that state we were just in?
Yes, just pure consciousness in the absence of any objective content. Just
Okay.
the experience of being aware, or aware being, without being aware of anything.
And would you say if there's a perception of, sometimes you refer to it as a field, this kind of sense of spaciousness, that's one step, there's another step to go back? Does that question make sense?
When consciousness is described as a field or as a field of spaciousness, we are, because it's not possible to define or describe consciousness. All our words have evolved to describe the content of our experience. So there's no real language for to describe consciousness, and which is why it's why people tend to use poetry, because that pushes language beyond its normal limits. And indeed, it's why we have the arts in our culture, because the arts are, in their highest form, are the means by which we are taken to the experience of being aware without having to go through a rational process. However, for those of us that try to speak about consciousness, we acknowledge that ultimately nothing we say is true about consciousness. If we want to really speak the truth about the nature of reality, we should remain silent, as indeed some people do. But as one of the Zen masters said, if I speak, I tell a lie. But if I remain silent, I'm a coward. So it's true, if we speak about consciousness, we are sort of telling a lie in a way. But if we don't, we're avoiding some sacred duty that some of us feel impelled to speak about these matters. And in order to do so, therefore, we have to borrow language from that is normally used to describe the contents of experience. And we have to use it skillfully to try and not describe, we can't describe consciousness, but to evoke the experience of being aware. So we take the most transparent, empty, luminous, objectless objects from our everyday objective experience, and we use those terms to, as I say, not describe, but evoke what we're speaking of. So space obviously shares some of the qualities of consciousness. It is still something objective, but of all the objective experiences, it is one of the most silent. So we say that consciousness is spacious. We say that it is silent. We say that it is luminous. None of these words are quite right, but so the idea that consciousness is spacious, and for instance, a field. Again, to say that consciousness is a field, a space, is a concession to our belief that three-dimensional space is inherent in reality. So that as a concession to that belief, the teaching says, okay, let's assume for the time being that space is inherent in reality, in which case consciousness is a kind of space. No, consciousness is not a space. Consciousness has no dimensions, but it's not possible to think of or imagine something with no dimensions. So in order to enable us to think of it and to speak about it and to explore it in this way, the tradition says consciousness is a space-like presence or a spacious field, not only that knows all experience, but within which all experience appears. There's no real within inside consciousness because it has no dimensions. But as a halfway stage of understanding, it is legitimate to say, yes, consciousness is spacious.
Great, perfect. Jasmine, you had a question on ego dissolution. If you want to ask yourself, sorry, go for it, Bernardo.
Hani had a question, a follow-up question, I think that is relevant. I don't know whether you noticed it.
Yes, but someone had also put it in the note thing and it didn't
okay.
So I thought, yeah, trying to juggle three different avenues that questions are coming in. But if you really want to comment on that, Bernardo, now, if you feel like...
Okay, I'll comment very briefly because it's a recent experience for me. Rupert just brought me there like 10 minutes ago. So it's a fresh new thing. Hani's question was, isn't being aware of being aware precisely meta-consciousness already, a step in metacognition, as opposed to the foundational level? I'll share what has just come to me 10 minutes ago. Rupert brought me to a place where I know what he means by being aware of being aware. And it is not metaconscious. But the moment you tell yourself, oh, that's what he means, now it's already metaconscious. The moment you word it for yourself, what is it that I have just experienced as reflected on the mirror of memory? At that moment, it is metaconscious. But the thing that is reflected on the mirror of memory, before you bring words to it, before you bring metaconsciousness to it, is not metaconscious. And it's best described as just the pure awareness of being, as Rupert just did. It was that slight switch of words that he applied today. Instead of saying the awareness of being aware, today he said the awareness of being. For me, that slight switch did the trick for me. So now I am totally with him that it's not metaconscious what he's pointing to. But you cannot look at the finger. You have to go where he's pointing to. And then it becomes only metaconscious when reflected on the mirror of memory and when given words to.
Yeah. Can I comment on that, Amir?
Yes, feel free.
Yes.
Always just feel free to comment on each other's.
Yes. Bernardo, absolutely spot on. I know this is something we've discussed before, and there was possibly some discrepancy in our understanding about this. But what you've just articulated is absolutely right and in line with my understanding. And it's not a coincidence, of course, this evening that I didn't mention being aware of being aware. And in fact, in my meetings now, although I did bring out a book a few years ago entitled Being Aware of Being Aware, I very rarely mention being aware of being aware. Being aware of being aware. I speak much more now of the awareness of being, because I think it is it's more accurate, it's more evocative, by which I mean it has more power to take us to the actual experience that I'm trying to refer to. However, I still think that at a certain stage of understanding, the term being aware of being aware is valid, because it's a halfway step. Instead of being aware of experience, we are being aware of being aware. So it's a legitimate halfway step between being aware of experience and simply awareness of being, or being aware. Being aware is even more accurate than awareness of being, because still in the awareness of being we have a subject and an object. So just simply aware being, or being aware is even more accurate. But remember what I said earlier, that in using these words, I'm not trying to be accurate, I'm trying to be evocative. I'm trying to precipitate in each of us the experience to which I'm referring. So yes, I'm very glad you said that, Bernardo. Consciousness at the fundamental level is self-aware, but not in a self-reflective way. Its nature it's just aware of itself by nature, just as the sun illuminates itself by nature. It only appears to be meta-conscious when we start speaking about it from the point of view of an individual. So an individual does have to reflect back on their own essential nature. So from an individual's point of view, we become meta-conscious, but that's only from the point of view of the individual. From the point of view of consciousness itself, it doesn't have to reflect on itself to know itself. It knows itself simply by being itself.
If I can comment, since you, Amir, you invited us to comment on each other's comments, there was something Rupert just said as well that I thought is spot on, which is to think of consciousness as empty space. And then Rupert put a correct disclaimer, like, well, at the same time, consciousness has no dimensions and space has 3 dimensions. So it's not quite accurate. One thought that came to me, Rupert, was that if space is completely empty, then it actually has no dimensions. And this is a physically accurate statement to make, because dimensions require at least 2 contents within space that create a relation, and that relation is what gives dimension. If space is completely empty, there is no movement and there are no dimensions. You're always ever in the same place, because there is no other reference for you to judge movement, and that space has no dimensions because there is no other reference for you to judge distance.
Yes.
And so empty space sort of collapses into itself as a dimensionless point.
Yeah, beautiful.
Because you want to follow on?
Yeah, just a small thing. That was just spectacular, guys. I guess my question would be, how do you then distinguish that awareness of being, Rupert, versus deep sleep, the state of deep sleep? So the way that Bernardo described it, just before any kind of articulation, that state we were in, how do you distinguish it from what state we're in when we're in deep sleep, where, again, there is no objective experience that is being articulated?
I would suggest that in deep sleep, there is just the awareness of being. But because there's nothing objective there, when we wake up, and when we're back in the waking state, everything we experience in the waking state, apart from the awareness of being, is filtered through our finite minds. That is, filtered through the activities of thinking and perceiving. So when we, in the waking state, look back at deep sleep, we look back at it through the filter of thinking and perceiving, and project onto it a blank state. So in the waking state, we think that deep sleep is simply a blank, empty state. That's just how the awareness of being appears from the perspective of the waking state mind. It's the best the mind can do to say it's a blank state, because the finite mind can only know something objective. The finite mind imposes its own limitations on everything that it knows or perceives. So when the finite mind tries to look at the awareness of being, it cannot see the awareness of being because it imposes its own limitations on it. So it conceives the awareness of being as a blank state. In other words, it tries to bring the awareness of being within its own limited compass, and it describes it in a way that is consistent with its own limitations as a blank, dark, empty state. That's what it is from the point of view of the finite mind. But from its own point of view, it is simply its awareness of itself, the awareness of being, or being aware.
Research endorses what you said. The latest research, the researchers found a way to, well, doesn't take much creativity to do that, it just takes effort. They let people sleep in the lab, instrumented with an EEG cap in order to rule out dream states. And they would wake people up when they were sure people were not dreaming. And then it would prompt them immediately to say, okay, were you just unconscious? And people would say, no, I was conscious. And then researchers would ask, but conscious of what? And then people would say, of nothing. I was nothing. It was empty. I was just consciousness. And then they report it in a scientific paper as I forgot the exact words, but what they mean is empty awareness. That's how they report that state. But if you ask people immediately after artificially waking them up, the second after, were you gone? Was it just blank, or were you there? Were you conscious of something? And people say, no, I was conscious. I remember I was just there a second ago, but I wasn't conscious of anything. I was just conscious.
Yes. Can I add something to that? Just briefly.
Yes, always.
Yes, this is in fact something that's very familiar to all of us. We have all had the experience of being woken from deep sleep by the sound of an alarm clock. Now, if there was no awareness present in deep sleep, what would have heard the alarm clock, and how could the alarm clock have woken us up? That something must have been aware to have heard the sound of the alarm.
I'm wondering, because I made this claim recently to someone because it was very convincing to me, and they came back with something that I didn't have an answer for, and I wonder if you do. And my sense of it was like, oh, maybe it was kind of woken up in the same way. I think it comes from such, in a way, materialist understanding of the body. Kind of, if I turn the computer on, the computer is very much not aware of anything, and I press the power button on and I think they've conceived the body as totally unaware, and then something kind of switches it on but isn't consciousness, more like a button, like an off-on switch or something. I don't know.
So you're suggesting that the sound of the alarm switched, which was a physical experience in the body, switched on consciousness.
Yeah, something like that.
You still have to account for how the body hears the alarm. But perhaps let's not go too far down. I don't want to derail the conversation. But you still have to, at some stage, answer the question how the body heard the alarm. But let's move on.
I want to defend Rupert on this because I recognize the refutation you heard, Amir, but the scientist in me wants to dissect this a little bit more. Okay. The metaphor for the computer switching on requires the following. The very first part of the stimulus that you receive to wake up cannot be registered consciously, because consciousness has to be switched on first. Only then can you consciously register the rest of the stimulus, but the very first part of the stimulus cannot be registered in consciousness. So to put it in the context of the alarm clock, you cannot consciously register the first second of the alarm clock or the first ringing of the alarm clock. You can only register the second, the third, and onwards. But since I have paid attention, I can report from my personal experience that I remember the alarm clock going off I remember being aware of the very beginning of the stimulus. And the reason I remember that is that my alarm clock is a song. It's a song by an Icelandic band called Mum. And that song is structured in such a way that you cannot mistake the first note for the second, if you know what I mean. It ties all together without repetition. It's a song that you guys probably don't know because it's very niche, But I always remember hearing the very beginning of the song. In other words, I think Rupert is right. There is someone awake and aware during sleep that already registered the very beginning of the stimulus as a conscious experience. And that should not be possible in the computer turning on metaphor, because the beginning of the stimulus is what turns consciousness on. Therefore, there is no consciousness there to remember the very first part of the stimulus.
Let's go to Jasmine's question, which was actually the first question scheduled. And we went on an amazing detour, which very welcome. But Jasmine, if you want to, there's someone in the comments, Bernardo, just says they love Mum. So at least one fan for your perspective.
Cool.
Okay. Ready for my question?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to comment real quickly before I ask that question that I often wake up thinking, and I'm aware that I've been thinking for a while in my sleep, and especially if I'm stressed about something, there'll be a lot of thinking. It feels like there's a lot of thinking while I'm asleep, and I wake up and I'm still thinking about that. But that has nothing to do with my question. My question is, those who have had an ego dissolution during a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience describe the resulting unified state, after the initial fear of dying. Then it feels incredibly good, apparently. There's overwhelming love and bliss, etc. And I'm wondering why this would be the case. Why would it feel good after we die?
So let's first of all define the ego, because it's a term that gets used a lot and people have different understandings of it. I would suggest that the ego, or the apparently separate self, is a mixture of the self, if we can call it a self, the self or the being that we essentially are, pure consciousness or pure awareness, plus the contents of experience. So if you imagine mixing pure consciousness with thoughts, images, and feelings, this mixture of the two creates the separate self or ego. So the separate self is, we all feel as a separate self or ego that we are aware. We get that, we derive the experience of I am aware from its origin, pure awareness. But we also feel I am limited, because we feel that the awareness that we essentially are is qualified by our thoughts, feelings, sensations, and so on. So what is called an ego death is the separation of this mixture between awareness and the contents of experience. So in fact, what we experienced in the, if you followed me experientially during the brief meditation we started with this evening, was ego death. What were we doing? We were separating our essential self, the fact of being or being aware, from first of all our sensations and perceptions, then our thoughts, feelings, and images, leaving only the fact of being aware. That is the death of the ego. That is ego death. Why? Why does it feel good? Because awareness, divested of the agitation that it borrows from our thoughts and the sorrow that it borrows from our emotions, is at peace and inherently fulfilled. It feels good because it is the nature of awareness to be what we, from the perspective of the waking state, refer to as peace and happiness. That's why ego death feels good. Awareness loses its limitations, and thus it loses its agitation and its sorrow, and its nature of peace is revealed.
It must be something that takes practice, though, because I wouldn't describe what I felt as overwhelming love and bliss.
No, but I would suggest that if you stayed there, Jasmine, we went there very briefly today, but I would suggest that if you kept going back to your essential being, if you kept letting go of the entire content of your experience, and instead of just visiting your essential nature of being or being aware from time to time, but you began to live there, you began to sink more deeply into that experience. I would suggest that to begin with, you may feel it as a neutral experience, neutral with respect to the content of experience, but in time, its nature of peace would impress itself upon you, and in time, its nature of quiet joy. In fact, I would suggest that this taste of simply being or being aware is the experience that in common parlance we refer to as peace and happiness. Peace and happiness, normally people consider them to be emotions that fluctuate with agitation and suffering. They're not emotions at all. They are the nature of the background of all emotions. But as I said earlier, when the mind tries to formulate the nature of awareness, it can only do so in a way that is consistent with its own limitations. So the mind knows emotions and feelings. So it tries to describe the nature of awareness in terms of feelings. So it calls it peace and happiness as opposed to agitation and suffering. But by peace and happiness, I don't mean emotions. It's not an emotion. It is that which lies behind all emotions and is, in fact, the essential nature of all emotions, including our suffering.
Does it feel good because it's in contrast to how we normally feel? Like if I could stay in that state, would it eventually stop feeling blissful because it would just be my normal state?
It's not a state you can stay
Okay.
in. It's what you are. It's not a state. States are feelings, emotions, and the dreaming state. It's what you are. It's what you are now. You can't stay in it because it's what you are. You can overlook it and remember it. Or you can.
But if I die, can I stay in it? If I die, will I be in that state?
No, you'll never be in that state because you are already that. It's not a state. It's what you are. And when you die, you'll take off your first of all, your perceptions and sensations will leave you and will leave you in a realm of images and thoughts. And in time, those will leave you, but they will leave you as you essentially are. In other words, when we fall asleep at night, it's a little rehearsal for death. Now, I just want to put a little caveat to that. We don't necessarily go all the way back to pure consciousness when we die. There's a possibility that we don't go all the way back, but let's leave that for the moment. But the important thing, Jasmine, is that you won't remain in that state when you die, or it's what you are now and eternally. That being is not something that appears or is born and dies or disappears. It eternally is. There's no question of it having come into existence when you were born or disappearing out of existence when you die. It's what you eternally are. It's not in time.
I'll work on understanding that.
No, don't work. One last thing. Don't work on understanding it. The mind can never understand it because the mind imposes its own limitations on everything that it tries to understand. Work on experiencing it. Work on going to your being, or the simple awareness of being, or the fact of being. Just keep going back there in pauses during the day when your attention is not required by the world during the day. Keep going back there. Become familiar with the fact of simply being and sink deeply into it. So don't try to understand it. You can never understand it. I don't understand it. Taste its nature. That's where the conviction comes from. When you experience for yourself the nature of my being is ever present and without sorrow or agitation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thanks. Ben, if you're here, you can unmute and ask your question. If not, I'll ask it.
Yeah. Hi, Rupert. Nice to see you again.
Hey, Ben.
Bernardo, it's nice to meet you for the first time. As an engineer, I have so much appreciation for your work. Complements Rupert's teaching so well, even for someone who's completely open to it. I'll get right to the question, as I ask Rupert too many questions as it is in his webinars. This question is for both of you. Rupert always speaks of peace being the inevitable consequence of the non-dual understanding. Bernardo often speaks of his suffering despite his clear understanding. I'm curious to connect the two because it has implications for the rest of us. Is it valid to say that one expression of the fruit of this understanding is to increase the capacity to engage with life, even if suffering is still present in challenging circumstances? Buddhism speaks of the great sadness after awakening instead of the personal sadness, which is compassion. If so, Bernardo would be a great example of this. I'm curious how Rupert and Bernardo views this.
Can I go first, or should I give it a...
Yes, no, you go first.
I think the answer is in the very last part of Rupert's comment to the previous question. Towards the end, he insisted, don't try to understand it. It's not about understanding. And I think that's the difference. You said Bernardo understands it. Yes, Bernardo understands it, but it's not about understanding. And what is transformative is when the understanding sort of sinks into the body and retunes your very being. And that's more than understanding. And it may come from understanding, or it may bypass understanding altogether, because it's a mode of being. It's one way to put that. I'm trying to avoid the word state to remain consistent with Rupert's careful use of words. So that's your explanation. It's not something subtle or nuanced. Bernardo understands it, and that's his limitation. And to some extent, it may explain why Bernardo continues to suffer. And suffering through compassion is a big deal. It's something I didn't have before. This year, it's a shit show of suffering through compassion. Anger through compassion. It's a roller coaster, and it's not something I was prepared for, because that's not how I was. So I didn't develop any sort of coping mechanism while maturing to deal with this. So for me, it's I would say it has been recently more of a liability than the end of my own suffering. But despite the suffering, I can bear witness to one thing Rupert repeats all the time. There is peace. Even it's very palpable, even right below the suffering, right underneath the suffering, there is peace. There is a kind of, it's the stillness you get when you're not trying to change anything. When that part of you that's not really trying to change anything, when you can sort of be friends with it and integrate it, as opposed to let it be obfuscated or alienated or dissociated, that underlies even the suffering, and that's the silver lining. That's nice. That's not something I knew before, and it's certainly pretty nice. I'll leave it at that.
Shall I just add something to that? And that is that I think what you're referring to, the piece that you're referring to, Bernardo, underneath the suffering is the piece that is the nature of being or being aware, and that is not itself an emotion. So the emotion that you describe, suffering, is an emotion, but the piece that you're describing and that you're in contact with, that you feel behind that, is the true piece of being that is present behind all experience, irrespective of its content. So there may be still on the surface, by on the surface I mean in our feelings, there may be the experience of suffering, but the more and more the piece behind it is felt. And in time, and this is my experience, that the piece that is the nature of being, that lies behind all experience, including our suffering, is like the sun on an early foggy morning. That the fog is this haze that obscures the sun, although the sunlight is still visible. But as the morning goes on, that the sun burns off the fog. And I think that's the way this piece that lies in the background of experience work, it gradually, very often over a number of years, just slowly burns off the fog of suffering, the lingering residual suffering that still obscures it. And that suffering, it becomes more and more transparent, just as the fog becomes thinner and thinner. And the sun, and what is it that is burning off the fog? It's the sunlight. It's this piece in the background that gradually shines through the suffering, dissolving it. And the suffering becomes more and more transparent, leaving what you nicely describe, Ben, as I think you said the Buddhists call it the great suffering, was it? I've never heard that phrase, but I like it. What you're distinguishing personal suffering from impersonal suffering. So the personal suffering is burnt away gradually by the light of peace in the background, but it leaves this compassion, this capacity in us to feel another person's suffering or a group of people's suffering as our own. And Bernardo, I've listened. You know, we've known each other. We've been friends for a while now, and I've listened to your talks, your conversations with people from time to time, and I always enjoy them enormously and learn a lot from them. But I've noticed over the years that you talk much less now of personal suffering and much more of the great suffering, of compassion. So I've absolutely no doubt, one, that your understanding of these matters comes from experience. It's not just simply a logical, rational conclusion. I've no doubt that it comes from experience. I also feel, I witness this. I feel that this piece that you describe in the background is burning away the personal suffering and giving you a greater capacity to empathize and feel another's or another group's suffering. And I've been very, very touched by the conversations where I've heard you discussing world affairs and the great suffering, the impersonal suffering.
You know what is peculiar is that, am I unmuted? Yeah. The imagery you just brought up, like the sun burning off the fog as the morning proceeds, I can sense that. When the fog starts to dissipate and that peace starts shining through, what is peculiar, I don't know, maybe it's not peculiar at all, maybe everybody goes through this, but there is a voice within me that doesn't want that feels threatened by that. Like there is a voice within me that says, you should be angry. How can you accept what's happening in the world today? If that peace is coming through and the quality or the absence of quality, whatever, of that piece is, I'm not trying to change anything, I'm not even outraged, then that part of me reacts with outrage at the possible absence of outrage, if you know what I mean. There is a value judgment, there is a moral judgment that comes in. And this year, it's like this all the time. Like there is a part of me that I don't want this to burn the fog. I want to be in the fog. I want to be morally outraged. I want to be angry because it's the appropriate reaction to what's going on. So I have this dialectic, this dichotomy playing out within me this year. It's in a sense, it's interesting to observe this playing out, but it is emotionally charged. It's not neutral.
Can I make a comment? Buddhism talk about the great sadness being compassion, to differentiate from the personal sadness. And also it talks about the great anger. The great anger, different from personal anger, it's fierceness. And there's no doubt in my mind that's the place your emotions are coming from in response to the world events.
Can I add something to that, Ben?
Yes.
So you're right. The great sadness and the great anger. This is this impersonal outrage, and compassion. The great sadness, compassion, and impersonal outrage. But it's also, I think, important to remember the great love. By that I mean, love I define as the felt recognition of our shared being. The felt sense that we share our being with everyone, even those that we are outraged by. And that, yes, we feel compassion or the great sadness on behalf of the suffering in the world. We feel great outrage on behalf of the perpetrators of the causes of this suffering. But outrage without love is outrage without the recognition that we share the being of those that we are outraged by. It is in a way, it's more of the same. The people that are perpetrating these events that we are outraged by do so because they are, it's not impersonal outrage, it's personal anger or hatred towards another group of people. And that's what enables them to act in the ways they do. That they act in the ways they do precisely because they feel that the other is the other. So if our outrage is based on the same premise, if we feel that the people that we feel outraged towards are other than ourselves, then it's just a subtle, slightly more virtuous version of the same thing. So it's fine to feel this impersonal outrage as long as it is accompanied by the great love, the recognition that we share the being. That means we love the people we are outraged by.
Can I make a follow-up comment? This is so beautiful. Thank you. The Chinese phrase for compassion is 慈悲, actually makes up of two parts. 慈 means love, 悲 means sadness. So it actually inherently in the word compassion is composed of the great love and the great sadness you speak of.
Yes, but with compassion, the reason we feel compassion for another, even if we don't know them, we see a person or a group of people in the news, the reason we feel compassion for them is because we identify with them. That's what compassion means, compatio. It means to feel with. We feel their suffering as our suffering. That's easy if we feel we love the person. But so the feeling of compassion is always accompanied by the feeling of love, the recognition of our shared being. But our our outrage is not always accompanied by love. Compassion is always accompanied by love, but outrage is not always accompanied by love. Well, that's why I mentioned the importance that our outrage, it does not eclipse our felt recognition of the fact that we share our being with the one that we feel outrage for. It's easy to love the one we are compassionate towards. It's not so easy to love the one we are outraged by. But for those of us interested in these matters, for those of us who have a deep love of this understanding, it is essential that we love those that we are outraged by. Because if we can't, we're just doing what they're doing in a subtler form. And that, I think, is the only thing in the end that is going to make a fundamental change in society. If this understanding that we share our being, even with those we disagree with, that this recognition of our shared being, that we are one at the deepest level, must be the foundation of society, if society is going to evolve in a way that is consistent with this understanding.
Yes.
Thanks.
Can I add?
I think we might have to move, because I've got a few more, unless it's a brief comment. I've got a little list, Greg.
Well, it's a comment about the original question. It's a brief comment about the original question. I think even if we can understand this piece in the background of suffering, my original question was, as a halfway stage, a lot of us in the within this understanding, at least at a certain phase of our life, the fruit of an expression of the fruit of this understanding is a greater capacity to engage with life in situations where we probably before feel paralyzed by, and even when suffering persists, a capacity to engage with those situations, I think, is also an expression of this understanding, even when peace is still not fully established. That's just a quick comment.
Thanks, Ben. Great questions. And I think Carrie's question will follow on really well, because it relates to suffering, compassion, and how these teachings might. And I think it also relates to some of the comments that Paul has been making in the comments. I don't know, Carrie, if you're available, you had a question about how these teachings might help someone who maybe doesn't have the. Yeah, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry, my voice is I'm a little under the weather. So yeah, I'm just dealing right now with a parent that is struggling with loss of mobility, some serious health concerns, and she's very stuck in a materialist framework, and she doesn't have any understanding of these ideas that we're talking about here. And so it's very difficult to be her caregiver right now. So I was wondering how best, Rupert, if you had some advice on how I could like prepare myself to be with her. And not that I want to speak to her of these things, but let them show through me when I'm with her, and just bring it into, my caregiving. I don't know if you would have any comments. Sorry for my voice.
Carrie, you can't speak directly to your mother. Did you say it was your mother that you were?
It's my mom.
Yeah, you can't. You're not able to speak directly to your mother about these matters, which is fine. There are other ways that this understanding can be communicated. So, what's important is that you are established to the best of your ability in your true nature of peace. In other words, that you recognize this peace in the background of your experience, and instead of locating yourself, instead of living in the foreground of your experience, instead of living in your thoughts, feelings, and so on, feel that you live more in the background. You still have thoughts and feelings and engage in activities and relationships, but you've made your home, the place you reside, the place you stand in that place of being, in that place of peace. And if you do this, then you will somehow be modeling this for your mother, irrespective of what you say or don't say to her. Just your presence, taking care of her, talking to her about whatever you talk to her about every day. Just your presence will subliminally convey this background of peace to her. And that's really what you most want to convey to her in this circumstance. Our circumstances are obviously very challenging, but you want to give her a taste of the peace that's available to her in the background of experience, but she cannot avail herself of that peace due to her involvement in the foreground. So the extent to which you stand in this piece, as this piece, so you will convey it to her effortlessly. You won't even have to try. It'll just, and your mother will think, oh, at the end of the day, when you've gone home, she think, oh, it was so sweet being with Carrie today. For some reason, I feel relieved of a burden. She won't, and maybe there will have been no conversation about it at all. Just your presence will have taken her to her presence, to her being.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's that would be my hope. I hope I could do that for her. It's just difficult sometimes, but yeah, thank you.
And I wonder also in reading the questions and bringing the questions in, if I interrupted a interaction there, Bernardo and Rupert, with Bernardo, what you were saying, there's something in you that doesn't want to go to this piece. And do you feel like there's more to follow up there?
No, I think the main message is for me, which is what Rupert said, that even your outrage has to be couched in that recognition of shared being. And yeah, that's what I have to nurture more in myself. Because I do have the recognition, I just have to nurture it more. I think it's tough sometimes.
There's a couple of comments that I've just checked with Paul in the comments, and I'll reframe them as questions. So is what you're both talking about, or what you're saying now, Bernardo, is a form of cognitive retraining? And as a follow-up comment there, the argument is feeling circular, that we learn about thinking not to think and aware of being non-cognitive, but of course in truth never are. So, which I think relates to this strange thing that maybe you're saying, Rupert, about we have to use words to point to this recognition at some level, but yeah.
Cognitive retraining sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy. It brings to me at least some associations that I don't think are the ones I'm trying to get across, or that Rupert is trying to get across. The complexity of our being is such that there is limited applicability to training our emotions like monkeys. These things, sometimes they just rage, and they are forces of nature, like a hurricane or a lightning storm. And there is only so far you can go in trying to train it. I think the most productive way is to see through it, which is what Rupert tries to do. So I think if one is looking for a sort of a long-term viable way to relate to oneself and to nature in a more authentic way, then CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive retraining is not the way to go. These are things that are useful. For instance, if you have arachnophobia, if you have a phobia of spiders, then you can undergo productive cognitive behavior therapy or cognitive retraining to sort of eliminate that trigger, which has formed because of early trauma or bad associations. That's fine. But if you're looking for something deeper, more related to the truth of being the self and the truth of being in the world, then yeah, it goes a lot deeper than that.
Can I just add one thing to that? That I don't feel that cognitive retraining certainly the retraining of our emotions is important. I think what is important is to ask ourselves a question as to what is the origin of our actions and our emotions. Do our emotions arise on behalf of, and are our actions and relationships engaged in the service of a finite, temporary, separate self or ego? Or do our emotions arise on behalf of, and are our activities and relationships engaged in service of an impersonal being? And that's really the most important question. If our lives are dedicated to understanding and love, which are two different ways of expressing the same thing, if our lives are, if this is our deep interest, if our lives are dedicated to love and understanding, then in other words, if that is the source of our thinking and feeling and our acting, relating and behaving, then that's all that's important. Some people will express that in peaceful ways and will seem not to engage very much with society. Others will be much more vehement in their expression, will seem to be much more engaged in activities and relationships. And some people will be very gentle and mild, some will be very passionate and fierce even. I don't think that's important, and I don't think it's necessary for there to be a standard type of feeling or a standard type of behavior. There should be a whole range of behaviors from the passive and the peaceful to the passionate and the fierce. What's important is what is informing them. As long as our lives are dedicated to the impersonal expression of love and understanding, then I think our bodies and minds should be free to express that in whatever way is right for each particular body mind.
Have you dialogued much on this notion? Because I think you said there was no equivalent last time we had both of you together, at least here. You mentioned, Rupert, there's no equivalent in your thinking to what Bernardo's called the daimon. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Or which is not quite, if I've understood it at all, it's not quite the ego, the personal ego, but nor is it, let's say, the pure, infinite piece of universal consciousness. Yeah, has there been much dialogue between you on that? Because I suppose it comes down to, once there's a certain level of understanding of the, let's say, model of reality that is shared here, what the implications are for how we then choose to live. And these seem to me like potential two different ways of relating to some of these ideas.
Do you want to comment on that, Bernardo? Is it taken from your formulation?
Yeah. So I often talk about the daimon, which is, we have to keep it in mind, it's a metaphor. If I were to speak in a way that tries to be more accurate and precise, I would say it's a movement of the impersonal within the personal, or a movement of the impersonal that touches on the ego, touches on the self. And yet the ego recognizes it as a sort of an external force, because that movement of the impersonal does not have the egoic agenda in mind. On the contrary, it doesn't give the faintest damn about what the ego's plans and goals and wishes and fears are. And that's why I think it's accurate to call it the impersonal. And it's a movement of mind in the sense that it entails thoughts and emotions of some sort. It entails things like motivation, a form of teleology, an attempt to go somewhere, to go in a certain direction, which may have nothing to do with your personal safety, your status, your money, and none of that. And then I personalize that, and I call it the daimon, because that's what has been done for 2,500 years in the Western tradition. Socrates had a daimon. He was the first to personalize that which is fundamentally impersonal. So that's what I call the daimon. It's a movement of the impersonal within me that I've come over the years to recognize, and most importantly, to recognize as not my own ego, even though those are thoughts and emotions I can feel, which would lead you to think, and leads most people to think they are my own thoughts and my own emotions. Over the years, I've realized that's not my own stuff. In the sense, this is not my ego's stuff. And but still, they are identifiable movements, and the powerful movements too. To a large extent, they have come to guide my life. I wouldn't be here with you today if not for the movements of the impersonal, if not for the daimon and the daimon's agenda, which is sort of one way I try to explain this to myself is it's what nature is trying to do through me. Because my life is not about me. Nobody's life is about them. I mean, that's the most twisted story ever, to have a reason in a culture. And now we take it for granted that, your life's about you, my life's about me. Why? We are parts of nature. Why would nature be interested in doing something for your... It's like a pear thinking the tree is about that pear, or a flower thinking my life as a flower is about me as a flower. Of course not. We would laugh at that, but we take it very seriously when it comes to ourselves. And that's what I call the daimon. It's that impersonal force that's sort of trying to naturally act through you as a seeming individual. And I think Amir's question is there something comparable to that or relatable to that in where you come from and how you see things?
Absolutely, Bernardo. Very my experience is very similar. I started writing and speaking about these matters about 13 years ago. And up until that time, I was a ceramic artist. I lived in a beautiful old farm that I had converted in the middle of nowhere on the Welsh borders in Shropshire. And I'd been a ceramic artist for 30 years, and I just presumed that I would be so for the rest of my life. It had never occurred to me to do anything else. I had no desire to do anything else. But this understanding had been my private interest since I was 15 years old. It was my passion, but it was entirely interior. I never spoke about it apart to my immediate friends. It never occurred to me ever to write or speak about these matters. I never had the desire to do so. I never had the desire to be a teacher. I still don't like being referred to as a teacher and don't consider myself as such. But there was nothing in my own life that I was aware of that would ever have encouraged me to stop my life as an artist. I was a successful artist by that stage, exhibiting all over the world, in Japan and America and Europe and the UK, and I had a very nice life. But at a certain point, about 13 years ago, this interest that I had had all my life, this love of truth and understanding, it just began to, all I can describe it is it began to bubble up in me and kind of overflow. I just could not contain it. So I started writing, and then the writing turned into the first book, and the book into the first SAND conference, and so on. And then within a matter of a couple of years, to my utter amazement, 2 years later, I was no longer working as an artist in my studio. I was traveling around the world speaking about these matters and writing. I never had the desire to do so. It never occurred to me in all my previous 30 years of investigation and practice and meditation. It never once occurred to me to speak or write about these matters. But it was exactly as you say, Bernardo. It was like an impersonal force that arose from the inside that all I could do was say yes to it. There was no question of negotiating. Shall I do this or shall I remain as it was? It kind of took me over from the inside, and I just surrendered to it. And it just followed. And when I look back now on all the books and the retreats, I could never have manufactured that. It just took me over from the inside and seemed to, I never had a vision of what to do. I always knew what the next step is, and that's all I know now. What the next step is, all I need to know is the next step. So yes, I think my experience is very close to you, although it manifests in both of us in two different, very different expressions. But I think we're both leading our lives informed by the same love and understanding in two very different ways, because we're very different characters.
Daimons are very unique in that sense. They are impersonal, but they are differentiated in the sense that your daimon is other than mine.
We're both serving the same impersonal source, but expressing it in very personal ways, in ways that are uniquely tailored to our particular minds, the configuration of each of our minds. And you've been trained in science and philosophy, so surprise, surprise, you express yourself in those terms. I've been trained more in introspection in the Vedantic and Sufi traditions as an artist, so surprise, surprise, I express myself in that way. And
sometimes I describe it as, my life had nothing to do with what I'm doing right now. I was a computer scientist. I was busy designing media processors and building businesses. I once founded a business that was sold to Intel. So if you buy Intel processors today, chances are the media processor in that thing came out of my head at some point. And then this is the way I picture it metaphorically. Two diamonds were talking to one another, discussing how they can better go about achieving their goals. And then they saw me pass by, and one of them looked at me and said, "Oh, that boy would do." And that was at the same time the beginning of my slavery and the dawn of freedom. And there is no contradiction between these two things. There is tremendous freedom from being enslaved to nature, from realizing and accepting that your life is not about you. So you could describe this as accurately as a form of slavery and as a form of freedom. And they are, I don't know whether I'm managing to get this across, but there is tremendous freedom in not regarding your life as being about you anymore. There is a freedom from weight, from responsibility. Now your responsibility is to do your bit and not the end result. And when you make your life about yourself, then you are responsible for your happiness. You're responsible for everything that happens to you and what doesn't happen to you. And that's overwhelming. That's a weight, like the world is on the shoulders of Atlas, and you are Atlas, and you can't possibly carry that. And once that weight is taken out, and now you're a tool, you're a conduit, and you even get 10% of the time to do what you really want to do. Wow, there's tremendous freedom in being shackled to the diamond.
And Bernardo, if I could just add, when the two diamonds were talking and they saw that boy passing and they thought that boy will do, it wasn't just that boy will do. It wasn't just a random selection. That they thought that boy's mind has been trained uniquely. That boy's mind has all the skills that we require to express ourselves in a particular way, and therefore it wasn't a random choice. And it's for that reason that you find yourself talking about these matters in a way that a certain section of society, the scientists, the philosophers, they are able to understand. So it wasn't a random choice. That boy, they thought he'll do, but he's perfect. He's just what we're looking for.
I was carrying the right dictionary, and they thought, "Oh, that's the language we need."
Yeah.
And if I may, just because other examples might help elucidate different angles on this, my understanding, Bernardo, because these two examples of daemons have expressions that are maybe more obviously, at least to some people, very positive in the world, and it sounds, at least for you, Rupert, that's why I imagine, is that it's led you from one beautiful life to another beautiful life. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But Bernardo, if I've understood you correctly, sometimes the daemon can take a form that needs to be negotiated with, or I think you've even met. So I don't remember if it was Mozart or you mentioning that Mozart would have so many new compositions coming into his mind. It was either him or another composer, would have to drink and get quite drunk just to have some peace from the constant, spontaneous intelligence of nature coming through. But you've also, in a much darker sense, I think mentioned someone like Hitler, or even being enthralled by a kind of daimon of some sense that most of us would consider, appalling, and wish that he could have negotiated with, or transmuted, or expressed in a very, very different way. And if I may, just a much more trivial but personal example. When I'm doing curating these kind of events, it seems to me obviously very useful, but I'm sometimes have a great yearning and desire to play a very specific piece of music on the piano. I'm not very good at it. I'll never be good enough for anyone else to enjoy it very much. It doesn't seem to be of any great use to the world. I could imagine myself spending many hours just immersed in it for no reason that makes sense to me. So yeah, those are just some different examples of so especially from you, Rupert, because I haven't heard you comment on that, but if there's a dialogue that emerges from those comments would be amazing.
I don't think that daimons take away our moral responsibility. I think precisely the opposite. I think daimons need moral supervision from little metacognitive segments of mind that are in a position to pass value judgments and to say, this is just and fair, or no, this I shall not do because this is not just and fair. Daimons are forces of nature, like tornadoes, hurricanes. When a tornado destroys your house, it's not like the daimon was a sadist and wanted to do harm. It's a force of nature. It's a spontaneous unfolding of the energies that are intrinsic to nature. So they need moral oversight, and that's the sum total of my role, I think. It's moral oversight for whatever is trying to express itself through me, and that's Hitler's failure. Because Hitler surely had a daimon, an extremely powerful, compelling daimon that managed to mobilize the collective soul of Germany at a time of incredible hardship, at a time of inflation running in the thousands of percents, in which a large part of the German population was not only humiliated, but starving and cold. And that had been going on for 20 years after Versailles. So there was a daimon there whose agenda was the well-being and future of the Germanic peoples. And because there was no moral oversight, look at how it ended up. It's you have a cyclone in your hands and it's very powerful, but you don't want to steer it towards a settlement. It's going to do great harm. You have to calibrate it. You have to calibrate the hurricane so it goes to a wind farm, and that calibration, I think, is our human moral responsibility that we cannot escape from. But daimons are, at least in my experience, they're very largely morally neutral. They are forces of nature. They don't pass value judgments. There is a preferential direction they want to go, and a daimon can kill you or save you. Socrates' daimon killed him by not stopping Socrates from self-incriminating during his trial. Because Socrates' daimon would only tell Socrates what not to do. So when Socrates decided to not defend himself during his trial, the daimon didn't tell him to stop that. So he went ahead and didn't defend himself and had to drink the hemlock and died. My personal daimon, I mean, some people have daimons that are soothing and loving and energetic in a way that pulls you from the front. It's seductive daimons that make you want to go in a certain direction and sort of regale you with delight if you walk in that direction. That's not mine. My daimon is beating me from behind and pushing me from behind in a certain direction. And my choice is I will either go that way kicking and screaming, or I will go that way in some form of peace. But my daimon has discovered that I only ask the deeper questions and only seriously dedicate my energy to contemplating a certain question, a certain issue, or even, if I dare say, think about it, if I'm suffering. If I'm not suffering, I glide through. I have a million hobbies. I love to dive, scuba dive. I love to design computers from scratch. I got to a point in my life where financially I'm okay. I probably would be having fun all the time and wouldn't be writing the next book. But my daimon found an extremely effective way of self-torture, self in the sense of myself, that is constantly stopping me on my tracks and forcing me to ask the big questions and not take my eyes off the ball, off the philosophical ball. And it's been using that liberally for many years. I only had a holiday. It's ending now, but I have had a holiday for the past 2.5 years, which has been delightful. Suddenly, after the 10th book, after Science Ideated, I have the feeling that the referee declared that it's the end of the first half, and I got 15 minutes to sit down, relax, breathe, take a drink, and then we go for the second half, which is coming next year. But yeah, that's the kind of daimon I have, and I have a very, very clear feeling that because it's so impersonal, because it doesn't share my personal agenda at all, it can be deadly. It can kill you, and I would bet it has killed more than one or two in the history of human activity. There are artists whose daimons were so overwhelmingly powerful that it has destroyed them. One used to live very close to where I am right now, Van Gogh. Well, you guys would call him Van Gogh. No Dutch person says Van Gogh. It's Van Gogh, okay? Or philosophical daimons that have driven philosophers or mathematicians insane. Nietzsche's daimon was extremely overwhelming, drove him insane. Georg Cantor's daimon, the mathematician who had the fundamental thoughts about infinities, he went to a nut house and he died in one. These are cyclones. These are impersonal forces of nature, and they are dangerous stuff.
Your perspective on this, Rupert, perhaps a very different vocabulary.
No, I don't. That's a beautiful description. I don't have anything to add to that.
I was curious to steer and if it relates. Last time when we met together, you mentioned that the world may be a representation of the deepest layers of our collective finite minds. And the example you gave if I remember correctly, on a personal level, if I have a fearful disposition, I might dream at night of being chased by a tiger. And that the world may be somehow a representation of the deepest layers of our transpersonal collective minds, which is a very different way of relating to what's seen, and perhaps relates to some of what Bernardo was saying, of like a daimon might express itself through an individual in one way, but also what might be represented by hurricanes and other things that we might find some kind of symbolic meaning in. I don't know. I mean, first of all, because I've been to many of your talks, but not retreats, which I imagine go much deeper. Is that unusual? Is that unusual for you to talk in those terms? Because it's not something I hear in non-dual circles come up, apart from this one, but that might just be because I haven't been exposed to them. We often hear like, oh, the world is an illusion, or the world is a kind of shared dream, but that it has some kind of significance as a deep shared experience.
Yes, it's true. In the non-dual circles, we often, both traditional and contemporary, we often hear this phrase that the world is an illusion. And most in common parlance, for most people, the word illusion suggests unreality. If we say something's an illusion, we mean it's not real. This is not the meaning of illusion. An illusion is something that is real, but is not what it appears to be. You're looking at my face at the moment. My face is an illusion. If you reach out your hand, you won't find my face. But my face does have a reality to it, relatively speaking. When you touch my face, you touch the screen. You don't touch a face. So the screen, relatively speaking, is the reality of the illusion of my face. Well, my face is an illusion, but it's not unreal. It's real as a screen, unreal as a face. So the same is true of the world. When it is said in the non-dual literature that the world is an illusion, it does not mean that it's not real. It means that it is real, but it's not what it appears to be. What does it appear to be? A multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves made out of something outside and other than consciousness. That world, the world that presents itself to us through sense perception, it is an illusion, but that world has a reality to it. And you have to see through, just like you have to see through the illusion of my face to the screen behind it. We have to see through the illusion of the appearance of the world to its reality. Now, when I say through the illusion, that the screen isn't really behind my face, it shines as my face. The reality of the world is not really behind the world in some other dimension. It appears as the world. So the world literally is the one infinite, indivisible reality. It's just how it appears from our localized perspectives. And the analogy that you referred to is my preferred analogy. Bernardo likes the analogy of a dissociation, which is it's a very effective analogy. I use the analogy of the dream, where, let's say, the dreamer has a fearful disposition and they fall asleep and they dream that they're being chased by a tiger, but they don't see the dreamer doesn't see the tiger directly. The dreamer localizes themselves within their own dream and views the tiger from the localized perspective. So what is in fact an emotion of fear in the dreamer's mind, from the point of view of the character in the dream, it appears as a physical object, as a tiger. So the tiger is how the fear that resides in the dreamer's mind appears from the perspective of a separate subject of experience localized in the dream. So the tiger is, as you said, a representation from the perspective of the separate subject of experience, of something which is not actually made out of matter. It is made out of mind. Fear in this case. And so in this analogy, that the dreamer is infinite consciousness, whose dream, in inverted commas, appears from our localized perspectives as the multiplicity and diversity of objects and people in time and space. That's just how the activity of infinite consciousness appears from our limited and localized perspectives.
And Bernardo's indicated that when I don't know to what certainty or you feel this, Bernardo, that when we die, there's a potential that our insights might somehow be absorbed by mind at large, and the vision I get is somehow that the world might, in very small ways, be subtly influenced or changed. Or tell me, Bernardo, if I'm totally misrepresenting what you tried to say, but I'm just curious if there's resonance between you on that point, that perhaps, because to me that brings up this idea that perhaps a mystic that sits just absorbed in very deep peace is making a greater contribution to how reality not evolves necessarily, but presents itself, how it's experienced by everyone in deeper ways than someone who might, they're just kind of feeling good, but they're not helping anyone else. As an example of the implication of this understanding, if I've understood it.
Um, I am not sure that nature works in such a way that we can say, well, some make better contributions than others. And why am I saying this? Because I think it's a very human thing to try to give a score to things according to some human criterion of merit, which is usually a relative thing. Like if the rules of the game are as per capitalism, then your contribution to shareholder value can be scored in this or that way. This was done with me for 25 years. My life was ruled by my contribution to shareholder value. But this is a very human thing. I think it would be unjustified to try to project that very narrow, confining, utilitarian human perspective to what nature is doing and deal with human life in terms of the score that they have accomplished or the contribution they can make to the divine mind, to the mind of nature based on their insights. I'll call it intuitive, but I have a very, very strong, deep intuition that this is not how it goes. And I tell you why. There is somebody close to me personally who I often catch myself considering somebody who got stuck in her life, who has not gone forward for 35 years now. And there is then the temptation to say, well, let's give that person a low score in terms of the insights that person is going to contribute to the divine mind. But then it immediately comes back to me that, no, I'm anthropomorphizing things, because there is a certain uniqueness in the experience of being stuck for 35 years. There is a uniqueness to that experience. It reveals something about the potentialities of subjectivity, of mind, that are untouched by my mind, that I cannot even begin to relate to, because my life has been fast-paced from day one. It's a mental space. It's a room in mind that I have never visited, and that completely escapes me, and which is nonetheless a very, very integral potentiality of mind. Mind can be stuck in a place for 35 years. Now, if you ask me, do I think my contribution to the divine mind is bigger than the contribution this person is going to make? I would be forced to tell you, no, I don't think it is, because her contribution is as incommensurable to me as mine is incommensurable to hers. So I don't think nature works according to these scales. I don't think there is any one life that is worth more than another from the perspective of what we might call the divine mind or the greater mind. I don't think that's how it works at all. I think we make even a bigger mistake when we start trying to objectify this notion of value based on the number of countries somebody has visited, or how much money the person has accumulated, or how many scientific papers the person has published. And that, because we tend to try to do that, certain things fly over our heads. For instance, the significance of the trivial. How do I even begin to word the significance of the trivial? There is one movie maker from Poland. His name is Krzysztof Kieślowski. He has made some great films. And the wonder of his films is that he tackles the very big and the very trivial in such a way that they have the same felt value, the same felt significance. Significance, that's the word I'm looking for. That the significance of watching 3 drops of coffee hit a sugar cube, which is one of the scenes in one of Kieślowski's movies. It's a close-up on somebody stirring the coffee with a little spoon, taking the spoon out of the cup, and then two drops of coffee fall on a sugar cube. And the movie stays with that for endless seconds. And it's done in such a way that you realize that the significance of the two drops of coffee falling in the sugar cube is as great as the significance in the same movie of knowing that you had a twin sister that you never knew about. And the movie portrays both things with the same level of significance. And that was the genius of Kieślowski, that he could do that. And it's a pity that our culture today has completely lost sight to the significance of what we call trivial, not what we call banal. Banality is something else. I'm talking about what we cavalierly call trivial, a trivial life. A life of somebody who never left their hometown, who spent their life cultivating vegetables in the backyard, who perhaps never married and never had kids, and dies in as unseen a manner as was born. The significance of that can be overwhelming from a truly neutral perspective. Yeah, now I'm rambling. I'll leave it at that.
No, but I'd like to just add something to that, Bernardo, and really reinforce what you're saying, that from a materialistic point of view, if each of our minds were sealed containers, cut off from all other minds, then the significance of this person living alone in their cottage, cultivating vegetables, not communicating and not going out into the world, would indeed be insignificant. But if all of our minds, if our minds are not sealed containers, if they all exist in the same field of infinite consciousness and are therefore in contact with each other, then every single thought that every single person has or feeling is a thought that communicates itself to the whole and has an impact on the whole. And for this reason, to go back to what you said, Amir, right at the beginning, would the life of somebody who a hermit who lived in a cave, or someone who lived in a monastery and just devoted themselves to silent prayer, or what kind of a contribution do they make to society? Well, under the prevailing materialist paradigm, almost none. But if everything and everyone are immersed in the same field of infinite consciousness, and there are no real borders between entities or minds, then such a life contributes immensely to the whole.
There is an unimaginable universe behind every pair of eyes, right? There is a universe behind every pair of eyes.
And just for absolute clarity on this point, but do you then feel that, and again, not trying to make a hierarchy out of what's more valuable or less, that our experiences are, and maybe I'm just asking you to repeat yourselves, that our experiences and insights and lives are impacting reality at a much deeper level than a materialist worldview would acknowledge?
Absolutely. Under a materialist worldview, given enough time, none of our lives will matter at all. We are isolated in a rock, hurtling through space, has been doing it for 4.5 billion years. We have existed in the present form for only 200,000, thinking like we do for 30,000, and we will bring ourselves to an end rather quickly. And then the tectonic movement of the earth will eliminate every sign that our civilization has ever existed. And whatever you came up with under materialism will eventually mean absolutely nothing, which means that it already means nothing.
Again, just giving you space to comment, Rupert, if you want to. If not, I'll.
I think the implications of what Bernardo has just said speak for themselves and run so profoundly contrary to our deepest intuitions. that I don't think it's necessary to add anything to that.
So Jim, I think I see you in the list, so feel free to unmute and interrupt if you want, but otherwise I'll read it. So it's basically about psychedelic experiences, include other mystical experiences. Alex the Alter, a localized finite mind during a psychedelic experience, experiences ego dissolution and oneness with universal consciousness. Is this oneness for you due to the permeability of dissociative boundary, or is it merely drug-induced hallucination within the finite mind?
You're on drugs right now. It's a drug called serotonin, without which there is, in principle, under a materialist perspective, no mental activity. And by the way, chemically speaking, that drug you're on right now and have been on for your entire life is very, very similar to some psychedelic substances like DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which looks very similar to other neurotransmitters like serotonin. So is it a drug causing the experience? No, it never is. Serotonin is not causing your experiences right now. Serotonin is what your experiences look like. It's part of what your experiences look like from a perspective, namely from across the dissociative boundary. So we have to stop thinking about drugs in terms of causes and think about drugs and all matter in terms of appearances, images of mental phenomena. So a psychedelic a psychedelic experience is never caused by a psychedelic drug. The psychedelic drug is an image of a mental process going on in nature, maybe outside yourself, your alter or whatever, which when you ingest, you cause that mental process out there in nature to interact with your own inner mental processes. And what that interaction looks like is that psychedelic drug, say DMT, taking over the space of serotonin in your receptors along the synaptic clefts between your neurons. That's what that process looks like. So a psychedelic experience isn't a hallucination caused by drugs. There are no drugs as things. Drugs are images of mental processes, and that certain mental processes interact with another, leading to new effects, is trivial. Your thoughts interact with your emotions and causally affect one another all the time. A psychedelic experience is no different. That psychedelic drug is the image of an idea in the mind of nature that when you ingest interacts with your own internal ideation and may indeed weaken your dissociative boundary. That's what I think psychedelics in fact do. I think that's the mechanism of action. There is a process, mental process in nature out there that looks like a psychedelic drug. When you bring it in, it sort of partly dissolves your dissociative boundaries. Now, when I say this, I don't mean to say that every psychedelic experience is a valid mystical experience. I think psychedelics have the uncanny ability to let loose the trickster, to let loose that natural tendency of mind to deceive itself, to tell itself stories and take itself in those narratives. Other psychedelic experiences maybe are truly valid mystical experiences. I personally think I have had a couple of psychedelic experiences that were deep enough, breakthrough experiences that brought me to a place where the individual self not only didn't exist, it never existed. And returning from that space is very hard. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, but just keep in mind, you are on drugs right now, serotonin. And it's a psychedelic drug. Chemically, it has all the properties of a psychedelic drug. It latches onto the receptors, the chemical receptors along the surface of your neurons.
Just to add something to that. Yes, if as you say, Bernardo, psychedelic substances are not really physical substances, that they're how mental processes in nature appear from our localized perspectives. Then when we as you say, when we ingest a drug, it's really a mental process outside our finite mind, interacting with the contents of our finite mind in exactly the same way that if we read Meister Eckhart or William Wordsworth, or we listen to a Bach prelude, these are mental experiences that are generated outside our finite minds, interacting with our finite minds. There's not a lot of difference between the two. The difference is in the way they appear to us. But essentially, it's the same interaction of a process in consciousness, but outside our finite mind, interacting with our finite mind, and it has these mental processes have the power within them to dissolve our sense of limitation and therefore our sense of separation. But they don't, Jin. As you say in your question, I'm reading it now, is this oneness due to the permeability of the dissociated boundary, or is it a drug-induced hallucination within the finite mind? It's neither. This oneness is the nature of our minds. It's not induced by everything else is induced, but this is the one thing that is not induced. It is already the case. It is the nature of each of our minds, and our sense of being temporary, finite, limited selves is just it's a mixture of thoughts and feelings that are superimposed upon that essential nature, which make us believe and feel I'm not this unlimited, borderless oneness. I am a temporary, finite self. And when we ingest a so-called psychedelic substance, or we listen to certain pieces of music or read certain pieces of literature that have this, that come from this understanding and therefore have the power to take us to this understanding, then this sense of separation temporarily either expands or dissolves, and the underlying oneness, which is always present as our deepest self, shines through.
If I can add something that dovetails with what you just said, Rupert, I did psychedelics for the first time as an adult. So I went through it very systematically, read a lot about it, technical papers, non-technical papers, testimonials, and people talking about how overwhelming the experience is, how incommensurable it is with our normal references. So I had the expectation that I would be surprised, that the experience would be something like I had never experienced before. It would be disarming in the sense of being so alien, so foreign, so new, so fantastic, and I prepared with that in mind. And when I had the first breakthrough experience, I had 4 experiences before because I followed the protocol of increasing the dose very slowly with medical supervision. You know, I'm an old-fashioned square guy like that. But when I had the first breakthrough experience, it did take me by surprise, but for the opposite reasons. Because what was most surprising and shocking to me were 2 aspects of the experience. One, it was a memory. It was nothing new. It was, I was remembering everything. And that was profoundly disarming. And it was very personal. I was expecting, you know, other dimensions, other realms of existence, other. And it was all extremely personal, very, very familiar, remembrances of very personal. When I say personal, I don't mean personal to Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo Kastrup was not part of that. Personal in the sense that it's very, very close to that, to the I behind the me, if you know what I mean, to that pure core subjectivity. It was very, very close. It was not alien. It was not far away. It was not another dimension. And it wasn't new. It was as close as it gets. And it was a remembrance. Both were very disarming to me. And they speak to what you just described.
Do you have any comments that you feel would be useful to offer, Rupert, on how useful you've observed psychedelics to be on those who are pursuing the kind of peace you've spoken about that can come by through contemplation, the experiential aspect?
So sorry, I mean, I lost you at the beginning. Say that again.
I wonder if you have any, I know it's a very general question and it probably depends on case by case, person to person, but if you have any general comments on how useful you've observed psychedelics to be for people who are pursuing the non-dual understanding as an experience.
Okay, yes, okay. I mean, I think they're useful for exactly the same reason as I explained earlier, that it is useful to read Meister Eckhart and William Wordsworth and to listen to Bach's music. Those are just my preferences, but other literature. In other words, I think it is reasonable for and valid for the same reason. However, sooner or later, one has to give up reading Meister Eckhart and Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta and all these people, because all these people, they all point to the same truth, which is we have to go there ourselves. It's one thing to be for other people to lay out a pathway for us back to our true nature. That almost all, if not all of us, need that. We both need to be given the steps, and of course that there are different steps, there are different pathways, but it's essentially the same pathway back to our essential underlying reality. And they are, of course, also inspiring. So it's reasonable to read the sacred literature for this reason, and if psychedelic drugs are simply the appearance of mental processes in nature, then for the same reason, taking psychedelic drugs could be useful, helpful in the same way that reading Meister Eckhart and Ramana Maharshi are. But sooner or later, we have to put down our books. We have to put down our substances. We have to just close our eyes and go there in our own experience, not aided by someone or something else. We have to just, it's just between ourself and ourself. And psychedelic substances and the sacred literature, that they can all be helpful. They all take us to the brink. But at some stage, we have to go there naked. We have to go there on our own, naked.
Bernardo, do you want me to read that, or unmute if you'd like to read it yourself? If not, I'll
read what?
Oh, Corrado. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Rupert and Bernardo. I was just popped in my head the question whether that would apply also to practices such as meditation.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Corrado. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
Oh, no, I was done with the question. Thank you.
Yeah. Does it involve, does it apply to practice? Yes. Ramana Maharshi said this. He said, the purpose of all practices is to bring practice to an end. And because there is no distance from ourself to ourself. There is no, in other words, by that I mean there is no distance from the separate self or the ego that we seem to be and the infinite awareness that we truly are. Just as there's no distance between the actor John Smith and the part King Lear that he plays. If John Smith and King Lear stood at a distance from each other, then King Lear would have to practice to become John Smith. But there is no distance between King Lear and John Smith, and therefore there's no room for a path or a practice or even a practitioner. Likewise, there is no distance between ourself and ourself, and therefore ultimately the ultimate practice is a non-practice. If we were to take all the practices and pathways and disciplines and meditations and yogas of all the religious and spiritual traditions from the last 3,000 years, and we were to distill them all into the essential understanding, it would sound like this: simply be. That's it. simply being is not something we do. It's what we are. And sooner or later, all practices, all pathways, all disciplines, all yogas, they all come to an end in simply being. That's the purpose of all practices. And this is what, just one more thing. It's what, as I mentioned, Meister Eckhart, who I love, Meister Eckhart, his last prayer was this. He prayed to God to rid him of God. Because he realized, it's such a beautiful prayer, this prayer to God to rid him of God. He realized that his idea of God was still something separate from himself that could be approached through practice, in his case, through prayer, effort, and so on. He prayed to God to rid him of God, that he might recognize God or infinite being or reality as the self of himself, the being that he truly is. And he cannot approach that. He cannot practice that. He is that. It's just a matter of recognition and the means, that there are no means. In this approach, the goal, the origin, the pathway, and the goal, they're all the same. Simply being. Simply be. The awareness of being. That's it.
That resonated a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corrado.
Thanks, Corrado. And as always, Bernardo, I'll just trust you to jump in if you want. Otherwise, there's a question. Oh, actually, Christian, you have a small question.
Okay, so hello, Bernardo. Hello, Rupert. So my question would be regarding a topic which was discussed a bit prior, and that was moral responsibility of us humans. And my question would be, how can we be morally responsible if we have no personal free will? So I know we have no personal self, which, then no personal free will also, but then would that not mean we are just automatons? So, and everything is already decided, and where is the moral responsibility in that? Then where is place for moral responsibility?
Can I say something briefly about that?
Yeah.
If we know for certain that we are not a temporary, finite, separate self or an ego, if we know, and more importantly, feel that we are the one infinite reality, then others are no longer others. We feel that literally everyone and everything is ourself, and that single understanding informs all our actions. So for such a one, as Saint Augustine said, you love. He refers to this understanding of our shared being as love. The only moral code for someone who understands and feels this is love and do whatever you want. If love, that is the recognition of our shared being, informs our thoughts and our feelings and our subsequent actions and relationships, then that's all you need. It's the only moral code you need. There's no question of having free will or not having free will. Everything you do is in service of this recognition of our shared being. Now, if we don't have this understanding, we may intuit it, we may, but if we don't, in other words, or to the extent that we still believe we are temporary, finite, separate selves, then we feel that we have free will. There's no such thing as a separate self who understands that they don't have free will. The idea of free will is part and parcel of the package of being a separate self. So we should be honest. And then there's no judgment in this. If we believe and feel I am a separate self, a temporary, finite ego, then by definition, we feel that we have free will. And what should we then do with our free will? What is the highest thing a separate self can do with its free will? To harness its will to love and understanding. So we feel, okay, yes, I have free, we feel as a separate self, we feel, yes, I have free will. I have freedom to choose. I have freedom to act. On whose behalf am I going to act, choose, decide, relate? I'm going to act, choose, decide, and relate on behalf of love and understanding. And in practice, this would be as good as one who felt themselves to be the one and acted from love. In both cases, our actions arise on behalf of love and understanding.
Yes. So love just is the ultimate goal. And
yeah, in other words, in practice, it doesn't matter whether we have free will or not. What's important, if we know we don't have free will, then our actions are automatically arise in the surface of our shared being. If we think we do have free will, then we just make sure we use our love in the service of love and understanding. It doesn't matter. In practice, it doesn't matter.
Yes, then maybe one, this part is pretty clear, but then maybe one more question regarding free will. Without free will, everything would have been some kind of deterministic from start to finish. Without our, I mean,
it could be spontaneous.
Could be spontaneous.
Yeah, I sometimes suggest that God is a jazz musician, not a classical musician.
Yeah.
It's improvisation. It's not mechanical, predetermined. There's freedom, not the freedom of an individual, but consciousness by definition is free. There's nothing constraining it or binding it. It's there is freedom.
There is freedom. Yeah. Thank you.
If I can, in order to try to add something to what Rupert said, I'll put my hat of analytical philosopher now and try to approach it from a different perspective, which is not better than what Rupert did, but at least it's something else. The core of your question is the following, if I understand it correctly. If we don't choose our thoughts, if we don't choose our emotions, if we are just observing this stuff happening, then what is the point of my talking about moral responsibility? Because whatever will happen anyway. Whatever thoughts come to us will come, whatever emotions come will come, whatever actions are produced as a consequence of that will come. So what's the point of my talking about moral responsibility? So I'll answer this in two ways. One, a very superficial one that will get me off the hook, but will not address the question. And then I'll bite the bullet and we'll look deeper into this. The superficial answer is we have the unique capacity to observe things in a metacognitive manner. And therein lies our moral responsibility. We can make value calls, and nature unfolding spontaneously can't, because it's unfolding spontaneously, while we can look at it and say, this is good, or no, this is not good. That's the fruit from the tree of good and evil, the knowledge of, to differentiate good and evil. That's the fall of man, the fall into metacognition or meta-consciousness, the knowing that you are experiencing, and therefore being able to sort of withdraw yourself as subject from the phantasmagoria of experience and pass a value judgment and say, this is okay, or no, that's not okay. So that's the trivial answer. Now, the real answer is the following. Even if everything is ultimately determined, in the sense that even if nature unfolds spontaneously, the way it unfolds spontaneously is determined by what nature is, as opposed to what it could otherwise have been. Even in that case, it is very important to talk about moral responsibility. Why? Because for the sake of argument, let's pretend that nature is completely deterministic. In other words, that every outcome is the result of computing an equation. You have some input variables, and then you compute a certain operation across those input variables, and the outcome of that computation is an action. And that action is completely determined by the equations. That's a very caricatural view of determinism. Let's take it for the sake of argument. even in that case, the determined outcome of the equation depends on the input variables. In other words, depend on circumstances. So the decision you will make has as one of its inputs whether a bozo like Bernardo is doing the podcast circuit saying we have moral responsibility. The fact that that bozo is going around saying we have moral responsibility, that's a input variable
but Bernardo,
what is going to be computed. You understand what I mean?
Yes, but is that even made by you? What I mean, that input variable was already set if you take that long chain of events that led to it. So even in that case, these variables are not really variables.
Does it matter? It doesn't matter the least. Those variables are variables. What they are not is free variables. They are still variables in the sense that their state changes over time. If everything is determined, you will still not have the free will to change your next action because you conclude that everything is deterministic. You see what I mean?
Yes.
You will still do whatever you will do as a spontaneous unfolding of nature, determined by itself, determined by nature, by what nature is. Even if you have this thought, everything is deterministic, therefore it's all senseless, it's all meaningless. Even if you have this wrong thought, it will still not change the fact that you will do whatever you will do next, if you know what I mean. What I'm trying to get across to you is a view that in philosophy is called compatibilism, which basically means the whole discussion about the determinism is a red herring. It's based on a misunderstanding of what we're talking about, because it seems to require semantic space between determination and randomness, as if there were something else in between that is not determined, but is also not random. But there is no such semantic space. Whatever is not random is determined.
Yes.
Now, even if you believe in your free will, you still believe your actions or your choices will be determined by your wishes, by your dispositions, by your character traits, by your preferences. They are not going to be random. The difference is that you would think, oh, they are determined by things that I identify with, because I identify with my wishes, I identify with my fears, my preferences, my tastes, my dispositions, and so on. And I don't identify with neurons inside my head. That's about it. It's still determined. It's just the language of how you explain that determination that has changed. It's not neurons, it's my dispositions. Congratulations. It's still not random. So that's the view of compatibilism, that the determinists and the libertarian free will people, they are looking for semantic space that doesn't exist. Neither endorses randomness and neither endorses full determination. Well, that's a big red light telling you you've taken a wrong turn somewhere in your thinking. You have to review some of your assumptions. And the assumptions that you might have to review have to do with things like, if everything is determined, then it doesn't matter whether Bernardo is going around saying that we have moral responsibility. No, that's not true. Because Bernardo going around saying we have moral responsibility is an input variable. Now, did Bernardo choose to do that? Of course not. Who chose to do that? Nature. Why did nature choose? How did nature choose? Well, by being what nature is, as opposed to whatever else we could conceive that it could have been. But it is not. It is what it is. So it will do what it does, because it is what it is. Is this determination? Well, yes, literally speaking, in the spirit of it, it's not. It's free will. Because if your actions are determined by you, then you're free. You're just not free not to be what you are. You see the point?
Yes, yes, yes.
So if the universe is determining everything it does by being what it is, then there is free will, and there is no free will whatsoever, because the universe has to do what it will do because it is what it is.
Yes.
It does not have the freedom to be what it is not. Only illusions have the freedom to be something else. Things that really are what they are. And free will and determinism now collapse into the same thing. It's two words to say the same thing. If you truly understand this, the question of free will disappears as a completely meaningless story. It doesn't hold any water whatsoever. So it makes all sense of the world that bozo called Bernardo is going around the podcast circuit saying we have moral responsibility. That it's important. That's an input variable of the internal dynamics of this organism we call existence. Part of that organism that is unfolding the way it does because the organism is what it is. And it means that Bernardo is going around saying that we have moral responsibility, even though Bernardo has no choice in the matter because Bernardo doesn't exist. You see, it's part of the internal self-regulatory dynamics of this great mind that we talk about. So it's important because it's an expression of what is. So if Bernardo is not going around doing that, then no, the internal dynamics is not working fine, which is of course abstract because it will always work fine. It's a reflection of what it is. The question disappears. It becomes a red herring. That's my invitation to you. You might be looking for semantic space that doesn't exist. If you take 2 or 3 steps back and you contemplate this with new eyes, you will see that the free will and determinism ultimately at the base level of reality are not distinguishable. There is absolutely no difference between the two things. And if you think there is, you're seeing something wrong. That's my hardcore analytic philosophical perspective.
Yes. So basically, no distinction between being deterministic and free will at the base level. That is the answer to that, and then the problem is solved.
The only distinction you can make between free will and determinism is the following, because nobody interprets either one of them to mean randomness. We have to take randomness out. So we are left with determinism. So what do we mean? Are we free to choose or not? What we mean is, are the forces that determine the choice part of me or not part of me? For instance, if I go to work in the morning because the forces of society beyond Bernardo force me to go to work in the morning, then I'm not free to make that choice. But if I go to work in the morning because that choice is determined by my own dispositions, because I want to go to work, then we say it's a free choice. No, it's determined in both cases. In one case, it's determined by my dispositions and my preferences. In the other case, it's determined by the social dynamics. So the difference is one of, do I identify with it as agent or not? But it's determined in every case. At the level of true reality, there is no outside. There are no external forces. The universe does what it does as a function of what it is. Every choice is determined by itself. And every choice is free in the sense that it's an expression of the dispositions of the universe and not an external force, because there is nothing external to the universe. If you see this, you will understand that the whole debate is a linguistic red herring. It's shadows in words, shadows in language. Doesn't correspond to anything that actually exists.
Yes, thank you. Pretty clear now. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Rupert, so we're past time. Do you have energy for one more following question, or I know you have an early start?
Let's do one more question. Yes.
Okay. So Saliha, you have what feels
why don't you do Amir? Why don't you do all the questions now to Rupert until Rupert has to go, and then I'll stay longer, and then I can take the other questions.
Okay. So in my list, there were no more that I could see that were referred specifically to Rupert. But I would say this one feels like a good direct follow-on to what we just discussed.
Okay.
Saliha, are you?
Will you read it? Actually, I have to go pick up my children.
Oh, really? Okay.
But I didn't want to miss one bit.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, pleasure. So, Future Farmers, Salia says that she would love to hear your thoughts, both of you, on the coincidence of opposites, how the opposite of one profound truth can be another profound truth. Free will, no free will, time, no time, the one, the many. And maybe directed more to you, Rupert, since you'll have to leave first.
I'm just going to give a very brief answer to this question. All the opposites exist for the finite mind, but they don't exist for the one. They don't exist for infinite consciousness. There's no opposite of infinite consciousness. So in its own experience of itself, which is simply the experience that we know as the awareness of being, there's no question of opposites, and therefore no question of coincidence between them. So the awareness of being, which is awareness's experience of itself, that is prior to and independent of the content of experience. All the opposites only pertain to the finite mind, not to consciousness. So that's really. I'm sure Bernardo will have can do a much more in-depth analysis and philosophical analysis of the coincidence.
I'm afraid I can't.
It's true. Can I just say one other thing? Because then I need to go. I've got a very, very early start tomorrow. So I'd like to say one other thing, because we started on a very practical note, a very experiential note. Can I just share with you all a very practical? I'd like to finish on a similarly practical note and experiential, and really just share with you a practice that I have, that I've practiced for many years, and I often recommend in my meetings. And it has to do with one aspect of our conversation earlier, when we talked about our impersonal outrage being informed by love towards those for whom we feel outrage. And I have a very potent, very powerful practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. In very extreme forms of it, they have a practice where one is required to eat rotting fish. In other words, to take something into oneself for which one would have tremendous resistance. And what I'm going to suggest is a kind of sort of contemporary expression of a similar practice. It's a practice that comes from the tantric tradition, and it is simply this, that and this is, as I say, this is something I do myself. I take the image in my mind of somebody that I love deeply, in other words, someone with whom I feel that I share my being, and therefore it would be impossible, inconceivable and impossible for me to knowingly do them any harm, because I feel that their being is my being. What I give to them, I give to myself. And so I take an image of my son, and I place that image on the mantelpiece, so to speak, in my mind. And then I take the image of someone that for whom I don't naturally feel this shared oneness, someone that I might feel impersonal outrage towards. I may not know them personally, but someone I hear in the news. And I take their image and I place it on the mantelpiece in my mind beside the image of my son. And I go back and forth in my mind between these two images. First of all, I confront the personalities, the characters, the individuals, the way they think, the way they feel, the way they look, the way they behave, and so on. But I keep contemplating them both until, not just intellectually, but I can feel through those two images to the being that each of them essentially is. So that, for instance, if each of them, my son Matthew and this other character that I choose, if they were both to do the contemplation that we started this meeting with, letting go of perceptions, sensations, feelings, images, thoughts, and they were just to remain with their essential sense of their self, just the awareness of being or being aware, they would both arrive at the identical experience. You wouldn't be able to distinguish the two experiences. And I contemplate them both until I feel that. We all understand that. I understand that, but I keep on contemplating them until I can honestly look these two people in the eye, in their image and my head, and feel that not only do they share their being with each other, but they share their being with myself. And this is it's a very powerful meditation to do, both about people that we hear about in the news that we feel outraged towards, but also in personal relationship, intimate and otherwise, when we are in conflict with anyone, to see through the conflict, which is always consists of thoughts, feelings and actions, to the being that we share, and then we return to the content of the conflict, but informed by this felt sense of our shared being. So I wanted to share that. I wanted to finish on this very experiential note that pertains directly to a conversation we had earlier.
I need to do that exercise a lot.
Well, I'm sorry I have to leave you. I have a very early start tomorrow, but Amir, thank you again for the invitation. Bernardo, thank you as always. I always enjoy our conversations enormously and always learn from your perspective. So thank you, and thank all of you for your insightful and interesting questions.
I'm particularly grateful for your starting meditation today, because I've come to places I hadn't been before. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Rupert. I get a real sense between you both. It's such a joy to hear you, because it's like a musician seeing a dancer and composing on the spot based on that. And the dancer, it's very different languages you both speak, but really, resonating. And so it's a real joy. So thank you again, Rupert. It's been a real privilege and honor. And we'll pass on words to everyone here who don't know your work, so they can hopefully come to more of your talks and retreats. And now they've got a taste for it.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Okay. So, and you're happy to stay a little while longer than that? How's your okay, so there's a very... Well, before I go straight to questions, I wonder if there's anything else you want to reflect on that conversation, the series of this evening so far with Rupert. The place you went to in your mind that you mentioned is...
I can reaffirm my appreciation for Rupert because of all the non-dual sources of wisdom out there. He's probably the only one I can sort of relate without reservation with, because he's so careful about his usage of words. An inconsistent or casual or confusing use of words tends to characterize a lot of the literature in the non-duality world. Particularly my favorite non-duality teachers of all, Nisargadatta Maharaj. He contradicts himself on an average of 5 times per page. So it's sometimes it's just aggravating. And with Rupert, I go on board with him without reservations, because he's so careful about how he uses words. And he often very subtly defines the word, the usage of the word he's making. For instance, in his meditation today, I don't know whether many of you noticed that, but he consistently, every time he used the word love, in the next statement, he qualified what he meant. He said, love is a recognition of shared being. And it's very important to do that, because otherwise people will come out of that thinking, well, love is infatuation, because a lot of people think that love is infatuation. And it couldn't be more different. And Rupert sort of very subtly, without your even knowing it, he navigates that minefield, taking you by the hand, and you don't even know that he's doing that with you. He's brilliant in that regard.